Hello and welcome to Roshango's Reviews, the show where I tell you my thoughts of the latest Hollywood pictures in theaters near you and whether or not you should go see them. I'm your host Aaron Bolio, and welcome to the show. So, right now in San Diego, we got Comic-Con going on, which is a great time of year for getting a handful of movie trailers for some upcoming, mainly superhero movies, but there's always some big reveals there. And the trailers I've seen so far, on Batman vs. Superman, I'm looking more forward to than I did before, but I'm still not incredibly hopeful with Zack Snyder taking the project. And Suicide Squad, I really don't have any feelings towards yet. And I think the two movies I'm going to be talking about tonight are a cautionary tale when it comes to such trailers. It's a cautionary tale of expectations and why they should be kept low, because if you keep them too high, you're bound for disappointment, and that's what we got tonight. So I'll get started with our first movie, Minions. Minions being the spin-off of the very, very popular DreamWorks movie Despicable Me, which I love. It's one of my favorite movies. Animated movies, I should say anyway. But it's definitely a really, really good movie. If you don't know, Despicable Me was that movie with Gru, our villain, adopting 3 little girls and learning that life is not just about being a bad guy, and learning that he is a much better father than he is a villain. But of course, the very popular characters in that movie, the little yellow guys themselves, the Minions, which were the comic relief and had all the laughs in that movie. So much so that they made a sequel with even more Minions, and I guess now a prequel? That's what this movie essentially is. It's Minions getting their very own movie. Well, what's it about? Well, we learn that the Minions have existed far before human beings ever walked the earth. As a matter of fact, they start off the movie with the Minions as these little amoeba creatures. And the purpose of Minions is one simple thing. They have to follow the baddest, evilest, most despicable being around. It's what their whole purpose in life is. They just feel incomplete without following some sort of evil, diabolical master. Whether it be the biggest amoeba in the gene pool, going on to T-Rex, to mankind itself. And then we start going to individual evil beings such as Count Dracula and the Pharaoh and all sorts of historical figures until we end up in the 1960s. Where our Minions are pretty depressed. They continue to fail master after master. They've been kicked out of home after home, and now they've just made a home for themselves in Antarctica, trying to, I believe Antarctica anyway, they never really clarified, but living in an Arctic cave, trying to make a new life for themselves. It goes great at first, but they find themselves depressed and without meaning because they don't have a master to follow. So Kevin, Stuart, and Bob, 3 of the Minions, decide to set out on a quest, a journey to find the most evil, diabolical, most despicable human being on the face of the earth so that his tribe can be Minions once again, which leads them to Orlando, Florida, and Villain Con, where they meet the baddest, most evil woman in the whole world, Scarlet Overkill, played by Sandra Bullock. And they try to gain the trust of Scarlet Overkill as she sends them to steal the Queen's crown in England. If they can successfully steal this crown, she will welcome the Minions into her home, and they'll be able to serve her just as they always intended. And, God, this was such a disappointing movie. I was looking so forward to it, too, because I really loved the first Despicable Me. And the second one, although it wasn't as good, was still very funny. This one just, it definitely made me laugh. I'll give it that. It was a very funny movie, sometimes. I think the most positive thing I can give it to it was it had a lot of energy, and that energy at least kept me invested, even when the movie wasn't as funny as I hoped. But I guess this is just a cautionary tale that comic relief is meant to be comic relief. And I know that my best instincts were telling me when I had first seen the trailer for Minions that this was probably not going to be that great of a movie because putting comic relief in the spotlight almost always ends in disaster. And although Minions is probably the best example of it working well, it still just wasn't as good. These were just characters that weren't meant to be the mainstay. They weren't meant to be the heroes of the film. They were just meant to be the silly, goofy comic relief that the kids could enjoy and the adults could enjoy as well. And that was what made them so great in the first movie. We had a big, gripping story with Gru trying to get along with the girls, trying to become this evil bad guy, and ultimately trying to steal the moon, which was one of the funniest things in the whole movie, the concept of stealing the moon. And although we did get a little bit of Gru when it came to Scarlet Overkill, which I'll get to in a little bit, but it was just so much better with the Minions coming in. I'll give you a good example. Now, in Despicable Me, there's a scene where Gru is trying to steal the freeze ray from Vector. And the party is Gru and a few other minions. And it's really fun watching Gru being the focus, but these minions still trying to help him out and devoting themselves to helping him, but still having their little goofball moments along the way. It just worked really well having these minions work off of Gru and Gru work off the minions. In this movie, they have kind of a similar scene where they go out to steal the Queen's crown, which only 3 minions are present doing so, but there isn't like a leader of the group. The minions are asked to not be minions, but think for themselves, which that doesn't work well. They were never meant to have that role, to be that mainstay. Now, when Sandra Bullock is on screen, however, as Scarlet Overkill, and John Hamm as her husband or boyfriend, they never really clarified, but I think husband can be inferred. That was when the movie got really funny, because both of them, Sandra Bullock and John Hamm, I swear to God, were always meant to play villains in an animated film, because they nailed it in this movie. I enjoyed every minute that they were on screen, because they acted sort of like Vector, for those of you who have seen the first Despicable Me, as these two just over-the-top bad guys, and they were almost a throwback to some classic cartoon characters when it came to these evil, dastardly villains. It was so great watching them, and that was what I loved about it. It reminded me more of Despicable Me when they were on, where they were being more of the focus, but the minions were still there being goofy and joking around. And when there was just the minions, it did not work as well, which is a damn shame. And the other thing, too, was it was fun that these minions, you never really knew where they came from, what they did. All you knew is there was a ton of them. And I always thought in the first Despicable Me, the more minions, the better. Watching just this whole army of these weird little yellow guys fighting. But for most of the movie, it was just the 3 of them, Bob, Kevin, and Stuart. And it just felt like 3 minions trying to be the focus was just not well enough. It would have been better if it was just the whole gang in comedic situations, but the rest of the minions are in the cave for the first half of the movie, and then you would get an occasional scene of the rest of them. And they tried really hard to give Kevin, Stuart, and Bob, the 3 main minions, their own little character traits and whatever, but in the end, they were still just minions. It was really hard to differentiate them, and yeah, they did definitely have their own little quirks, but then when you see the rest of the minions, it just kind of reminds you that they're one, each of them individually is just still part of this gigantic yellow pack. And something else that really kind of grated a lot, and this was another reason why making the minions as the mainstay in the movie probably wasn't the best of ideas, was the fact that they always speak in that weird little language where, occasionally they say an English word, but they usually make weird beeping, booping noises. And that was really funny in the first movie because they had to rely on a lot of physical comedy, which this movie still does, and still does a lot of really good physical comedy, but it's really hard when you're trying to make the main characters of the movie not speak. And what's interesting is that, I was hoping that we would at least see, enough of them, we'd be able to infer what they're saying enough in the movie. but we simply didn't in this one. It felt like a lot of scenes weren't really written well, where it almost felt like they were where the minions talking was really important to the scene. But because we don't understand what the minions are saying, we can't do anything with it. You know, it's not like a silent movie where they went into it saying, we can't have audio and we're going to keep the verbal dialogue to a minimum because it's a silent movie. So they wrote it around the physical comedy and all that stuff. They did that for the most part in this, but it just felt like in a few scenes they kind of forgot that we don't understand what the minions are saying, and trying to physically translate what they're saying by their actions didn't pan out in a lot of those scenes. Now, I will tell you the movie's strongest point, however, and I feel a little weird saying this, and I felt a little guilty saying this as I watched the movie, but when the movie got dark, that was when it was at its funniest. I mean, they had scenes where people die in this movie. People actually die, and you get to watch it, and it's hilarious. I know that's really dark, but that was the highlight of the movie, just these little weird, silly guys that you would translate to talk well with kids, to be very appeasing to kids. These cute little guys that maybe you'd see on a kid's show like Pee-wee's Playhouse or something, get in dark situations like torture and murder. But these scenes are just done so well, and they were just really funny deaths. I know it's really blackening, but when they were trying to be silly and cutesy, it just wasn't working. It felt like I was watching a show that was meant for really, really little kids, which I guess this was, but when it got dark and when it got a little mean-spirited, that was when it was at its best. I think that's what made the first one so funny. It was watching a comedy revolving around a guy who is despicable, as the title suggests. And that's why I think the second Despicable Me wasn't quite as good, was because Gru was trying to be a good guy, and it was just so much more fun watching him be bad. Like, in the first movie, when one of the first things we see Gru do is go in line, get his coffee, and he uses a freeze ray to cut in line. You know, just that kind of dark, mean humor worked really well. Suffering, if done correctly, works really well in these movies. And that's why the Minions, I guess, should not have been the main characters at all. They were really great comic relief that people could work off of and could lead to dark moments like that. But just having them by themselves led to more cutesy scenes and not as much of the dark scenes that you would get with the main state villain. And that was the other thing that was fun, was Gru was the main villain and the Minions had to follow him. So I guess to summarize it, I'm giving Minions a 6.5 out of 10. It had enough energy to keep me going, and I did my rule of clock with this, where I never actually ended up looking at my phone to try to figure out what time it was and wondering, oh, is this movie going to end? It at least kept my interest, and it did make me laugh hard at a lot of scenes. But I guess when it comes to this, I figured out why pure comedies aren't as good as they used to be. In the original Despicable Me, when they weren't being funny, they had a really good dramatic story and a really touching story with Gru and the kids to keep it going. But they also had a lot of comedy with the Minions. In this, we have a lot of comedy with the Minions, and then really nothing else to sort of counteract that or fill in the blank spots where the comedy wasn't as strong. And the weaknesses in the movie just kind of come out front and center. So you can kind of hit or miss with Minions, but if I was you, I would just go grab the Despicable Me DVD and pop it back in and watch that instead, because that's where the Minions belonged. Now on to the second movie I'm going to review tonight, which was Selfless, another movie that disappointed me greatly. For those of you who haven't seen the trailers, which I've seen a few, but it wasn't one of the really, really big marketed movies right now, Selfless is about a man named Damien who is an incredibly wealthy, great visionary. I guess they kind of compare him to Steve Jobs and such. I guess he's an architect, is what they kind of allude to, but they claim that he's the man who built New York. He's this billionaire, and he has some of the greatest ideas ever, and he's made some of the most iconic buildings ever, and he's done some very big things, and he had a huge impact on society. And unfortunately, Damien, who is played by Ben Kingsley, is close to dying. He's dying of cancer at the age of 68. They say that he's only got a few months left to live. And he's approached by this mysterious corporation who claim that they can keep him alive by a process called shedding. What shedding is they take his body, and a body supposedly made in a lab, and basically transfer his life from his old self to his new self. So he goes from being a 68-year-old dying man, and they move his life, I guess, into the body of a man in his 30s, a very healthy Ryan Reynolds. So, on the brink of his death, he decides, I have much more to give, and so he does that. And it's a very expensive procedure, and they only sort out the greatest minds. But he's one of the very first ones. They claim that only about half a dozen to a dozen or so people have done this procedure before. So it's a little experimental, and they're still trying to run out the kicks. They basically give Damien, in his new body, these pills and says you have to take these every day, or you're going to having seizures, and you're going to start getting these weird little visions and start hallucinating. So what Damien ends up happening is that he starts enjoying his new life. He starts enjoying this new youth. He has both youth and experience to a degree. I'll maybe get to that later. But he's enjoying a new life in New Orleans, where he's still seen as a very rich man and trying to be a visionary, until one day he forgets to take one of the pills. And that's when things start getting bizarre for him. He starts hallucinating badly. He starts seeing this woman and her daughter, and he feels like he knows them personally. He starts seeing the town they are, and he realizes that this is a real place and those are real people. When Damien tries to investigate further, the corporation who is providing him with the pills and the support are claiming, it's just a side effect, Damien. It's nothing to worry about. But soon Damien finds out that this corporation is looking over his shoulder really, really closely. And so when Damien decides to investigate, he discovers that, as the movie puts it, he thought he was buying a new body, but it turns out it had some mileage on it. Damien discovers that the body he is now living in once belonged to a former U.S. Marine. And this woman and the daughter were the man's wife and children. He discovered that this man had decided to sell his body to help his daughter get through an operation that they couldn't afford. He basically gave his life. And this outrages Damien because he discovers that he's literally stolen the life of somebody else when he thought he was going to be getting basically a test tube body. The corporation sees Damien as a threat to their further progress, and the rest of the movie kind of features him being hunted down. Now, I saw this trailer when I first started doing this show, actually. One of my first couple episodes, I first saw the trailer, and I thought, what an amazing idea. A man buying a new body to live forever, to find immortality, but it comes at a cost. He learns about how he's stolen someone else's life, and now he's conflicted. And oh my God, did this movie completely let me down. And it hurts, really, because I really, really wanted to like this movie. The more I watched it, too, they continued with some really good ideas. And it felt like maybe if you rewrote the script a few more times, you could have had a masterpiece on your hand. But that's Tarsem for you. If you know who Tarsem is, he's a director who's done a few movies, but mostly music videos. And one of his most famous movies was The Cell, which is another movie that was critically and audiences both panned badly. It was a colossal failure. But what The Cell was about was basically the premise of Inception, where you go into the mind of another person. And in this one, they go into the mind of a serial killer because they're trying to find where one of his victims is before she dies. And that is also a great premise, going into the mind of a serial killer. But Tarsem, it just feels like he's completely inept in storytelling and creating character, that these great, brilliant ideas continue to just fall flat. I'll tell you what I mean. For starters, one of the big things in a movie, and I did actually end up checking my clock a few times in this, so that already deducted points, but I guess even with Minions, what I just reviewed, was the energy and such kept me invested in the movie. And that's a big thing of keeping audience attention. Audiences need to be invested. They can't just be consciously knowing they're watching a picture. And that's what the best movies do, is they suck you in. You feel like you're a part of it, or at least you feel like you're a part of the experience and the atmosphere. You feel like you're almost living in the world that they're presenting to you. And that's what great movies do. This, I was fully aware that I was looking at a screen in a movie theater. I just never felt like I was in this or part of this. I just couldn't invest in it. They just did not do a very good job with that. And I think one of the biggest reasons why is the characters were really, really generic and bland, which hurt this movie a lot. I really couldn't tell you two things about Damien other than he's a great visionary, which we never saw any examples of in the entire movie. As I said, I think he's an architect. That's what they at least alluded to, but I never really saw any examples of his great visionary mind as an architect. They never said, like, this was a building he designed. So he was bland as hell. And Mark, who is the man whose body he's stolen, we learn really nothing about him either. And in a movie like this, with this premise, that's key. We need to basically see the contradiction between Damien as Damien and Mark as the man whose body he has, because he starts to become Mark in a little ways. He starts to like, for example, his military training, because Mark's a Marine, that kicks in for him later on. It's things he's never learned before, but somehow he knows. And it would have been really awesome if we got to know a little bit more about Mark through these visions and flashbacks, and we got to learn a little bit more about Damien from before the procedure, but they kind of just jump right into it. And if we could see those contradicting personalities kind of present themselves in one person, that would have made for a much, much better film. But because of that, I just felt disconnected. I just kind of went, okay, he's an old guy in a young guy's body, and the only reason why I'm saying this is because I saw the procedure happen. Other than that, I had nothing else to really connect me to it. And I also mentioned earlier the the experience of age with the youthful body in sort of a Benjamin Button way would have made this a much, much better movie too. It would have been much cooler to see how this procedure would play out in real life. But I think that was the thing that got me the most, was this was a missed opportunity more than anything else. A missed opportunity, because they ended up trying to make this an action film in a lot of scenes. They have these really decently choreographed scenes, but it felt like I was trying to watch a James Bond movie or something, but it was kind of a poor James Bond movie. They were kind of your basic stunts, your basic guy pulls a gun, military training kicks in, he bats the gun out of his arm and takes down another trainee. It was these generic scenes I've seen in action movies replacing what could have been great substance in this. I'll give you another example of what I mean by that. One of the great reveals in this movie is that the pills that Damien is taking are suppressing Mark. And basically, when he doesn't take the pills, Mark's personality, his consciousness, starts kind of fighting back. And that's when he starts having the flashbacks and having Mark's memories. And if he does not take the pills for a allotted period of time, Mark's personality will begin to overpower his, and Mark will regain control of his body, and Damien will, I guess in a conscience sense, die. But if Damien keeps taking the pills, Mark becomes more and more suppressed, more and more of his memories become erased, such as the military training, such as the relationship with his family, and all this. And I thought that was a really, really awesome idea. Basically, they set up a moral dilemma. Damien is killing himself not taking the pills, but he's essentially killing somebody else if he does. Not just somebody, but somebody who has a wife and family who desperately miss him and desperately want him back. It was such a great dilemma. I was so curious to see what his choices were, to watch this inner struggle, to figure out, am I going to let Mark die and leave his family widowed, or am I going to keep myself alive? And they did barely anything with it. They kind of at the end resolved what they saw as a loose end. But I wanted to see throughout the whole movie this kind of internal struggle. There was maybe a couple short glimpse moments where it felt like they were at least pointing in that direction. It was just a missed concept and a missed opportunity in so many other regards, which is a shame because, as I said, there was a lot of great moments in this movie, some really awesome plot twists. And the other thing was, this mysterious corporation created a lot of atmosphere because it almost felt like they were everywhere. I'm not going to go into too much, but there was a great twist later on with Mark finding out that his friends and such that he's now met were actually spying on him for this corporation to make sure he doesn't spread the secret. It's just, that's the best way I can describe it. Great, great, great premise that led to a mediocre film. So Selfless gets a 5.5 out of 10. It just promised so much and delivered so little, and I wouldn't recommend seeing it. I would recommend for a filmmaker in the future to try and remake this in the way that I think it was intended to be made, because, God, I love this premise so much, and I want to see this premise done right, but it was done so poorly, and it just, I never felt like I was invested or cared. So, sorry for the disappointing weekend this week, but I hope to see you all next week, and I hope you at least find something good to watch this weekend. I'm Aaron Bolio. Have a good night.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.